the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we have a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We have made our Discord server available to patrons. We have had some past reading groups. There's some extra material available. Just consider that if you're enjoying what we're doing. Today, we're going to be having a look at Freud's The Ego and the Id. Before we dive headlong into that discussion, I want to post a spoiler for the audience, the listeners, and the patrons, and that is that we have reached a singularity in terms of our work, and we are working to actively write a book, largely based on the discussions we've been having. I mean, I think this text was actually, for me, really Bataille's The Accoucheur, and this reading really helped solidify kind of the direction that I think we've been moving towards this whole time that we've had these discussions. So I'm incredibly excited. I dare say we have done philosophy. Maybe you can mitigate my grandiosity. My grandiosity. We've developed either a concept, an operator that I think is relevant to this discussion too. So I just want to start out there. What we've developed together is this concept of the petit mort a. We're drawing on, obviously, Lacan's objet petit a, the structural cause of desire. We're drawing on petite mort, so the little death, which is a French euphemism for orgasm, and the concept of amortization as laid out by Simone Donne. As we move through today's discussion, I think the relevance of this concept and these homages, let's say, will become crystal clear. Taylor, I might throw it to you and allow you to start us off with what you're thinking, because I know I have a ton of material that I could go with, so I want to give you a chance to speak.
We'll be able to tell the readers more as we further develop and are able to work more energetically on the book proposal and some of these things without you and I are fervently discussing together. But yes, I guess we can leave it here as spoiler alert. We're writing a book together and we'll have more details soon. For now, we'll just let the audience know that we're excited. This is one of the culminations of working together for 5 years. We try to weave in a lot of the things that we've discussed and learned and what has changed and what we've read, and sometimes things that we never get to discuss upon first reading a text, say like this one, may crop up years later. We're constantly able to revisit and reshuffle the proverbial deck of cards that it always feels like we're having to move too quickly through these things, right? Because we don't have world enough in time to spend on every text we do. So it's nice sometimes that every episode we do together, and every time we chat, new shit comes to light.
There's the irreversibility of the time that we spend, right? Like our time is finite. I mean, this goes to the book. One of the central themes of the book is there's a scarcity to our time that we're investing and so forth that kind of structures our actions and desires. So, but that also is part of what this text does too. I interrupted you. I want to let you.
No, you're
if you
fine.
have anything else,
you're fine. I would say we'll be able to say in the coming weeks more about this, and I know next week we're going to have Charles Duvall on. He's published a new book of his own that is a series of reflections on the Deleuze seminars. I know we've had him on to talk about them indirectly, especially about his role as main translator of the Deleuze seminars. We've had Dan Smith on as well, who runs that program through the Purdue website. So next week we'll be able to talk to him about his new book, and I'm sure he'll, whether off or on the recording, be excited to hear about some of our ideas in the book that we're writing together. In terms of the present book, the 1923 Ego and the Id, I guess I would put in context at least some of the genesis around it, since give some of the historical stuff, get that out of the way. Obviously, you and I have discussed beyond the pleasure principle, and so the reader can see quite clearly that that is a turning point in Freud's reflections, specifically with the introductions of the notions of the death drive and life drives, Eros and Thanatos. He takes those back up again in this volume. And the other thing I would say too, he's also picking up from the series of metapsychological papers from the teens, from specifically 1914, 15, etc. For example, you can see, and again, we've spent time on this, you can see continuations of reflections on the drives and their vicissitudes, the paper on the unconscious, the paper on narcissism, the paper on mourning and melancholia. All these get references. And obviously, the other book that is in close proximity, coming right after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is Group Psychology, the book on group psychology, which we haven't looked at yet, but it's important as well for a lot of these reflections. And the last thing I would say is that this is the reason why he begins this work with talking about the dividing line, defining limit of psychoanalysis, what he calls the shibboleth that separates psychoanalysis from other approaches to the mind, specifically philosophy, and other forms of psychology. He's taking back up this polemic he led specifically in that 1915 long essay entitled The Unconscious, where he is leading a polemic against classical rationalist philosophy that sort of naively believes that anything related to the psychical or the mental is restricted to consciousness. He is revisiting the gauntlet that he has thrown at the feet of a certain type of philosophy, let's say, that conceives of the psychical as that which relates to consciousness, as conscious thought. And I would say, just to get it out of the way, because, I'm revising before submitting my final draft of Anne Sauvignargue's book on Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, Freud, he doesn't go all the way, but there's a lot of resonances with Deleuze on this point, where Deleuze is also taking up, for example, arguments from Nietzsche about how thought, the act of thinking, is not something that is related to the will, to consciousness, to decision, to that this type of idea that thought is imminent, that thinking is imminent to reason or the understanding or mental faculties. As we know, Deleuze is often characterizing imminence as that which is to be regarded as the highest principle. But in this case, believing that thought or thinking is imminent to the thinker is actually a no-no, because for Deleuze, thought comes from the outside, and it comes from a certain violence done to thinking. And there's a genesis of thinking within thought, but it's not a purely imminent one. There's something that comes from outside. So here, I think, and this is why he even will grant a limited, in difference repetition, a limited role to transcendence, because in the Kantian framework he's reworking, it's the transcendent use of the faculties that becomes important. I'll leave that aside because that's not important for today. But again, I think we shouldn't forget Freud begins this work reminding us of this polemic against a certain type of representative classical type of philosophy that thinks that thinking or consciousness exhausts, I should say conscious thinking, consciousness exhausts the psychical, or is the important part. And I think that Freud shows quite clearly that what we call thinking cannot be relegated to consciousness alone. In fact, far more of our thoughts and thinking are much deeper than that. If we want to use the notion of depth, which he pretty much allows us to.
I think maybe I can find a way to synthesize that with this text because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to propose that this goes to the Grodek quote that Freud uses here relative to what is it? It's like the we're lived.
He takes from a thinker named Grodek the notion of the id, which also can be found in Nietzsche, but Grodek may be more directly conceptualizing it, whereas Nietzsche, he's got other concepts to create. Page 17, what we call our ego behaves essentially passively in life. And this is according to Grodek. And that, as he expresses it, we are, quote unquote, lived by unknown and uncontrollable forces. That's Freud's way of saying this notion of the id, das Es, or we could call it the it if you wanted to, right? Since das Ich, the I in German, is being translated into Latin for Strachey, the ego, id, which is it in Latin, is the choice here. So we are lived by these unknown and uncontrollable forces.
So
That's where he gets that term.
I read that along with Deleuze and saying that primordial forces, these intensities below representation, are what is ultimately generating thought on an imminent basis as we encounter new problems because of kind of the historical accumulation of things like the id, which Freud in this text says that we inherit the id. So we inherit kind of the psychological or the psychical baggage of this like undying unconscious that traces back. The id is like the deep strata, whereas the ego and the superego would be higher levels of the strata. Tell me if I'm reading, if you're seeing kind of what I'm saying relative to thought being kind of imminent and coming from the quote unquote outside, kind of like the. Do you see what I'm saying? Am I making sense, or do I need to go
No,
a bit further for you?
I think you are, because you're saying two things. One, you're alluding to Freud's phylogenetic arguments about the inheritance of the id, whereas two, we have to think about the ontogenetic consequences. Freud will point out that the ego eventually differentiates out of this ego id complex that's sort of undifferentiated milieu in the helpless living being. That would be the two things we should distinguish, is that Freud is making ontogenetic or psychogenetic arguments about the origin of each individual mind and the differentiation of the ego outside of standing apart from the id ego complex, but also a phylogenetic argument, as you were saying, in terms of this inheritance. And I guess the other thing would be, this is why Freud sort of is making an inside outside, which he often does, distinction, or along with a hierarchical higher lower, because he will talk about the ego as surface differentiation or a differentiation surface in his arguments about the ego being primarily a body. And I guess the last thing I would say too is this question of thought being imminent. I mean, the question would be, if we are lived by these unknown and uncontrollable forces from the id, I would take a Simondonian argument and say that, yes, Freud is right, I suppose, to call the id this internal reality, and the ego is in the external world only reaches that internal world by means of the ego. It's the representative of the external world for the id, as he says, just as the superego is the representative of the internal world for the ego. So there are these layers. And I would say, in the Simondonian way, to bolster this argument about thought coming from the outside, would be that just as in vital individuation, there are membranes whereby membranes allow for Simondon to make these arguments that in the living being, there are these folds or membranes that can act as interior and exterior milieus to one another. So to a certain extent, while the id is quote unquote an internal or inner world, it acts as an external world to the ego because there is no direct access. This is kind of like Lacanian ecstasy, where what is most internal is external. And so I would say that still allows us to discuss or to agree with Deleuze that thought is given rise to by a violence from the outside, right? A sensible sign is what he says. Notice, though, that Deleuze and Guattari don't really like to spend too much time talking about this topological metapsychology that Freud's presenting here of the ego, id, superego. They kind of forego discussing that in a way that doesn't mean that we can't sort of consider them in dialogue. That just means that there's more free reign for us to try to negotiate these terminologies. But in any case, yeah, so the id, and this is an interesting thing, the id is the reservoir of libido in a way that Freud is ambivalent about, because he will later say that it's the ego that's the reservoir of libido. And it just depends on the way that we approach these things, because it depends upon how we look at, if we put the emphasis on primary narcissism or secondary narcissism, and how we look at object cathexes and narcissistic or ego cathexes, etc. But to get back to this point that we get from Groddick, it's obvious that the id is, we can call it the deeper level of the unconscious, because if part of the ego is unconscious, say in the resistances, the id is the much more sort of dark terrain, the libidinal chaos.
My instinct is that it goes to strata, which I do think, like, this idea bodily ego is projected surface lived by forces, suggests one of the three strands of thought or ideas that I want to explore in our conversation today. That is the embryonic version of a schizoanalytic idea, being the I as a configuration in a larger set of these cartographies that we're tracing, etc. Freud is mapping out here in the ego and the id. He's mapping out from the psychoanalytic standpoint where the mapping of ego, superego, and id, which don't necessarily have distinct borders, let's say, like there's a diffusion into one another, but he's mapping out the unconscious. And this is laying the groundwork that Guattari picks up and runs with schizoanalytic cartographies, where he's he's drawing directly from Freud, and like the way that this piece really, it contains that diagrammatic illustration of the the one, it kind of like resembles like a bagpipe. You might be able to help fill me in, but
it looks like a bagpipe. It looks like a Pac-Man with a little top hat.
I mean, I encourage the audience to go have a look at schizoanalytic cartographies, just because the diagrammatics in the book are intensely confounding, but also the curiosity that they draw is also palpable. Like, it's a really intense just to look at them. Hopefully one day we can tackle that book and try to delve into that madness. One seems like that's like the terrain of that book. I won't spend much more time other than to say seems like a real challenge, but just for fun, go look at that book. Maybe I can find a PDF to link in the show notes or something like that.
Since we're talking about the ego and the id for now, and we'll get to the superego later, it is interesting that he relates. So if the ego is dealing with the external world and is the representative of the external world for the id, we have to be conscious of this representative nature of his arguments. He even says that the ego represents what would be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions, blah, blah, blah. But did you notice this analogy where he says the ego in relation to the id is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse, which obviously he's talking about the drives, with this difference that the rider tries to do so with his own strength, while the ego uses borrowed forces, we can imagine forces from outside, right? Forces from the external world, forces from the body, even. The analogy may be carried a little further. Often a writer, if he is not to be parted from his source, is obliged to guide it where it wants to go. So in the same way, the ego is in the habit of transforming the id's will into action as if it were its own. I think that's important too, that Freud, unlike, say, again, classical rationalist philosophy, is attributing a will to the id and not to what we would consider conscious thought. Again, this is to sort of, it's a dark will. It's an unknown and uncontrollable or barely controllable will. I thought that was interesting. The analogy of the horse and the attribution of a will to the id.
What a mistake to have ever called it id.
It's whoever said the id.
The id. Oh, I always fuck it up. God damn it.
It's the id. Yeah, that's the interesting thing, right? As though it were a singular entity or a substance, an it. There's a
I mean, there's a fidelity to Freud in that idea that the unconscious is this kind of immortal thing. Am I right?
Well, okay, so immortal, but also you could even use, if I hazard the term, it's amortal in the sense in which it forgoes knowledge or recognition of death. Freud even alludes to this later in the book, where he said it so clearly earlier that death doesn't have any real meaning for the unconscious, right? The unconscious is ignorant of death. He sticks to this very clearly throughout his work. He says it just in passing here, but that's why I don't even think. Yes, you could call it, but I almost would say it's beneath life and death in a certain sense. Even though Freud wants to make a dialectic out of Eros and Thanatos, but at least for the unconscious, strictly speaking, death is not of any consideration. And it's also, Freud has he doesn't allude to it here, but he has other things where the unconscious is ignorant of time, at least in the sense in which we process it chronologically and linearly. It's not aware of the chronological passing of time. There's a coexistence, if you will, temporally. Simultaneity, if we can even apply it, is much more apropos of describing the unconscious than succession. And this is, I think, why Lacan was clearly correct to seize upon the après coup, the Nachträglichkeit, the sort of aftermath and after effects in psychical life. We experience it chronologically as an after effect, but in the unconscious, there is no linear succession. There's a coexistence. Time and death are both out of bounds, strictly speaking, for the id or the unconscious, the repressed, if you will, the dynamic unconscious.
Real quick, I just want to make my kind of jokey comment about one thing. Well, some of it has substance. One of the things that I encountered or thought when reading this text was rather how much of a Kantian Freud is. As you were mentioning earlier in our text exchange, he brings up again the categorical imperative here in terms of terminology, but he also, was it in the economic problem of masochism as well, right?
Yeah, he does. And I believe, I could be wrong, I thought he might have made an allusion to it in Totem and Taboo, but I would have to double check that. But definitely in the economic problem of masochism, which we talked about just a couple months ago.
So I was kind of jokingly telling Taylor, started to make me think that we really haven't progressed that far from Kant, which he probably takes a little bit of issue with. But funny story is that I told the same thing kind of to Nick Land on Twitter. I told him real post-Kantian philosophy has never been attempted. I don't remember fully what he said, but partially he was like, oh, it's been attempted. I forget what the fuck else he said. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. But something I just thought of was really like the sort of debt that Freud has to, or really anyone, Deleuze as well, right? Deleuze has a certain debt to Kant. I think all of modern continental philosophy would acknowledge that.
That's why I brought up transcendental empiricism with you, right? He's twisting and reworking Kant very clearly, even though later on in his work, specifically with Guattari, that terminology drops out. Doesn't mean he's not still elaborating and building on the insights he has of a transcendental empiricism. Yeah, it means Deleuze post-Kantian in a way. Freud is at least aware of the categorical imperative. It's not clear how much of the Critique of Pure Reason or any of the critiques he's really read. I mean, he's obviously a widely read thinker, but we know he said, at least offhand, that he didn't really read Nietzsche out of anxiety of influence, that Nietzsche might have already done and said all the things that he wanted to explore.
It was the triadic forms that consistently are evoked by Freud, whether it be goes back to what was this project for a scientific psychology, where he posits the three forms of was it neurone or something like that?
The phi, psi, and omega neurones.
Then he's dealing with ego, id, and superego, right? It's a triadic structure. So like
these trinities are very Kantian,
which we understand there's a direct sort of antecedent line to the three syntheses of the unconscious as far as Deleuze and Guattari are concerned. Like, I don't want to disregard the transformation they're making, but I just want to sort of draw the kind of through line, the ontogenesis, if you will, the line of thinking that is being followed from a historical point.
I was coming to you with this notion of Freud's Kantianism more so with the fact that even though he has this polemic against philosophy, he is comfortable with adopting spontaneously this representative philosophy, where the ego is the representative of the external world for the id, or the superego is the representative of the internal world for the ego. This notion of representativity is highly Kantian, even if he's not aware of it. Again, we don't need to go off course here, but it'll be something I'll try to elaborate with you in terms of the book we're writing. It is interesting too, right, that Freud is very comfortable in thinking that in our conscious, pre-conscious life, we are dealing with representations. It's the unconscious that is, or I'll say that again. And the pre-conscious, we are dealing with, if we go beyond representations, we deal with word presentations, right? And I think that's why in that diagram on page 19, the perception consciousness, pre-conscious, ego, id, repressed, the acoustic, there is a sense in which the acoustic is added there because that is the input of word presentations. But in the id, or the unconscious, properly speaking, the repressed, it's more so thing presentations. And that also, he makes arguments for this in various places. Part of that is because it's more primordial to deal with things than with words, if we think phylogenetically in the development of the human species. So there's something more primordial there, primitive. And also, I think that this is where Deleuze and Guattari get to say the philosopher confuses words and things, or mixes them up like the schizophrenic. And for Freud, that's a highly undesirable likeness. Again, something of another polemic against philosophy. So when we do go into presentations, word presentations and thing presentations become important for Freud. Even though he brings them up in this book, they're not as important, but he will spend time on them at length in other writings. And so we shouldn't. So that acoustic little hearing cap added to the diagram is important for reminding us about word presentations, which is not just acoustic, because he's trying to make an argument about the superego. And he will say it's not just acoustic residues of word presentations, which form some of the domain of the superego, but also things that we read. Freud has a very interesting theory, I will say, I'll use it loosely, a theory of reading that you can see all the way back to the fragment on a case of hysteria, right? The fragment of analyzing Dora, where he is trying to find where was she exposed to sexual knowledge? And he goes into this whole hypothesis about her having this dream where she's got this big book in front of her and she's like supposedly reading this like a kind of encyclopedia of sexual knowledge, right? A kind of Kama Sutra in the Germanic tradition or whatnot. And he's like really interested in this reading source and her dream, which is devoid of parental conflicts. And so he's like hypothesizing about how the dream is a wish fulfillment where she's able to read at her own leisure and pleasure this book of knowledge about sexual reality without having to look over her back to see if her parents are going to come and like snatch it away from her and like punish her for it. And so like Freud's very highly interested in reading sources, literacy for the strengthening of the superego and its domain. It's kind of fascinating.
So as I mentioned, there's three strands or three ideas that I want to explore. Hopefully we can get to all three of them in today's conversation. The first being the outline of what I have been referring to as the suicidal wager of reproduction. In the text, Freud mentions, and this really got me thinking, this is part of what generated a thought that led to this idea of the book itself, is, okay, he mentions in the quote unquote lower organisms this tendency of the individual to die after it reproduces. And so we see this in terms of praying mantises. We see this expressed by salmon. I mean, there's a million different biological examples. If you have some to throw in there, definitely feel free. But I think, so this got me thinking. This started to make me think, okay, there's a suicidal wager of reproduction. So death is involved in this wager, in this risk maneuver, which goes back to last episode and Bataille, because there's risk associated with reproduction and there's risk associated with sexual display, horns, birds. I use the example of the bird of paradise that risks its life by preparing the forest floor, clearing it of detritus, etc., to perform its dance of seduction. So it's risking predation. It's literally wagering its life on this wager of reproduction. It goes to the idea that sort of sexual fitness as a shorthand, let's say, it mimics the logic of the potlatch, which says, I have prestige, I have value, I have potency, I have power because I can take this tremendous risk. I can risk my very life. And the bigger the risk that one can take, the bigger loss that one can sustain, the more prestige one can gain. So that's the logic of the potlatch. I can burn these blankets. I can destroy these copper shields. Like, the more that I can waste and risk without dying, the more powerful I am, the more vitality I have, right? This makes me a strong candidate for reproduction. This applies, so you can see the logic, the structural logic apply to both forms of exchange. So I take that and I extrapolate that into commodity exchange, where in every exchange, every purchase that we make, we are making a wager towards death. We are making a wager and taking a risk that this expenditure will be large enough to kill me, kind of, in a way. Going back to the same suicidal wager of reproduction, there's a kind of death limit that structures the desire, the relationship to desire here. I have been thinking for a long time. Guattari mentions in the Anti-Oedipus papers something he called machinic which I have always kind of been playing with this idea of Lacan's objet petit as a desiring machine, taking the desiring machine and melding it with objet petit in the sense that our desire is structured by a limit, yes, like acknowledging that there's a limit that structures desire, but it also conversely produces desire. Like, it's what generates the conatus needs something to get it moving. If we had infinite time, like if we had infinite time, then why would we wouldn't be in a rush. There would be no pressure. There would be no gradient pressure for us to act or produce. So it's the limit that does set forth the motion of desire in the first place. That's kind of one thread that I wanted to go at. And I think that, again, Freud mentioning that some of the lower organisms die after reproduction, that's really set the hook in me that there was a relationship here. The Thanatos and Eros, does he mention Eros and Thanatos in here? I can't remember. I've been all over the place with.
He doesn't say Thanatos in this one. He does say Eros. I don't know if he ever says here's Thanatos and Eros. He talks about Eros and death instincts, what
Gotcha.
we've been calling it death drives. It's in Beyond the Pleasure Principle where he will give death drive its classical Greek divine name, Thanatos. I'm just glancing back through the book and I don't see Thanatos mentioned, but he does say Eros at least a half a dozen times. On the top of page 46, because at the bottom is where he mentions the thing about copulation and the act of reproduction in lower animals leading to death. But at the top, he says the death instincts are by their nature mute or silent, and the clamor of life proceeds for the most part from Eros. So for some reason, he has stopped using the term Thanatos here. It's maybe a historical quirk of writing that he's dropped the divine name from death and death drive. Because obviously in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he develops more this argument with Weissman and Soma German, and right, the German that's immortal. The germplasm is immortal, the sexual substance, whereas the soma, the bodily vehicle, is just a kind of a vessel. He develops those arguments much more at length in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. There, he's willing to speak of Eros and Thanatos with capital letters, with their divine attribution, but death has dropped its divinity, if you will. Read that as you may. I don't know what to make of it off the top of my head.
I just want to build on this in the sense that, okay, Freud posits that in sexual reproduction, Eros and Thanatos fuse. And this kind of basic idea also got me thinking about the genesis of our book as well, because what I was thinking originally is that at the individual level, going back to the suicidal wager of reproduction, the individual wagers it stakes its life on reproduction. It assumes, that risk. So that's the death drive. That's the thanatic aspect. Okay, so the individual risks itself, but at the level of collective species, reproduction sustains the species. So that's the eros. That's sort of what I was fascinating me, was this fusion of these two alleged, the drives being sort of separate, and there being like a dialectic, which I think we transcend this. We go further than this in the book, but this was kind of the genesis of that, because I was seeing, okay, the bird of paradise risking predation and risking its individual life. On the other side of that, by doing so, it has a productive capacity as at the collective level. And so this same structure can be found elsewhere in a number of different domains or registers. I'm thinking primarily a star that supernovas. The individual star itself has a finitude. Doesn't have an unconscious per se, but it has a finitude. It has a limit, like death, not biological death, obviously, but a limit of some kind, like a physical limit or a chemical. I guess it's physics. As the star progresses in its lifetime, it accumulates the amortization, and its fusion can no longer be fueled. It reaches a threshold to where it starts to off gas. It can't create fusion. It goes down to iron as the heaviest element. I'm going to be very quick about this to not bog us down too much in the specifics. the star explodes, it's supernovas, or it goes into nebula. It may not explode necessarily, but if it does explode via supernova, then the singularity is becoming multiple, and it's sort of dispersing a milieu for individuation, just like the dispersal of the bird or the salmon or the mantis is kind of exploding. The singular being, the singular individual dies, but in its death, it yields further, I don't know what you would refer to it as, like going towards Simondon's pre-individual or like mother liquor, or you might have to correct me or like pick up the ball there a little bit. But I think the basic notion that I'm going here is for this individual expenditure being a sort of, and hitting a limit, and sort of death or limit being a productive thing. So this is the machinic aspect of the structural relationship of, let's say, objet A, which, like I said, we are theorizing petit mort A and extending this beyond simple psychical relations, beyond symbolic things. This extends to
Libidinal economy, as you're saying.
a cosmic sort of level, even,
Sure.
right? Like it operates at a number of different registers and domains, from down to
Beyond Freud's libido.
right. Yes. Yeah.
I would say one thing. It's interesting that Freud is going to put it a little bit differently, because Freud does use fusion and diffusion of instincts. And I think that it's a little bit obscure in this work, and it's something that we'll have to grapple with. But instead of using those terms, because you talked about in the sexual discharge of the substances that Freud's mentioning on the bottom of page 46, instead of saying that Eros and Thanatos come together in this discharge, it's actually, he's making this interesting argument that instead, in the sexual discharge, Eros is eliminated. And now the death instincts, Thanatos, has a free hand for accomplishing its purposes. So it's kind of interesting that if we take him at his word, he's agreeing with everything that you're saying, except instead of saying that in the sexual discharge leading to death of the lower organism, it's not that Eros and Thanatos come together, but that they separate. Eros is able to discharge its duty in the reproductive act and leave the scene behind for the death drive to do what it does best, which seems to be to allow for the ego to master the tensions in conjunction with the id. So this question of mastering tensions, we've talked about a lot in terms of, that's the whole purpose of the psychical apparatus in Freud's definition, is to discharge the buildup of tensions. So I think it is interesting that there's a sense of mastery here that Freud wants to propose. And then later he will even say what psychoanalysis, one of the things it tries to do, this is on page 58, psychoanalysis is an instrument to enable the ego to achieve a progressive conquest of the id. Again, I think Freud is maybe not contradicting himself directly, but if at what I read first, Eros is eliminated and the ego, sublimating libido, assists the id in mastering tensions. Okay, so there we have an assistance of the ego and the id. They're helping each other. But in page 58, psychoanalysis is going to help the ego conquer the id, master the id itself. And now they're not obviously in assistance, because Freud throughout the book has discussed the ego as really a slave to the master, which is the id. So there's almost this like revolutionary claim that like there's going to be an uprising by the ego against the id's dominance. And that's what psychoanalysis is trying to do in the work of analysis. There's these interesting intertwined, tangled web of claims he's making that's hard to dissociate and pick out. And I don't want to say that Freud is directly contradicting himself, but this question of mastery, as we know, came up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which this is a direct follow-up to when he starts off the book by saying, like, how is it that dreams as wish fulfillment, which is my primary hypothesis. How is it that there are these dreams of these soldiers coming back from the war and they're having these anxiety dreams where they're reliving the most traumatic tensions of their life by dreaming about these horrific scenes of the war they were just in? Does that not contradict wish fulfillment? And he says, look, it has to be that anxiety dreams are a means of implanting us back into the situation of a traumatic event and preparing and giving us the means to prepare enough anxiety, which is a mastery of the tensions, because if I prepare the anxiety, I am able to ward off the traumatic forces that overwhelmed me. He even uses the terms of overwhelming of the ego here, and he had, as early as 1894, been discussing this question of the ego being overwhelmed. Freud is constantly like obsessed with this question of mastery, of the ego being able to master not just the external world, right, which he'll talk about in Civilization and Its Discontents, but also here to master the id with the help of psychoanalysis. So like I do wonder about this language and its relation. So whether or not Eros and Thanatos come together or separate in the act of copulation leading to death is one that at least Freud seems to say they separate, but that liberates the death drive to do its work. And I think that it's a little ambiguous, and I would need to spend more time thinking about it. That was my only, like, I don't want to call it a correction, but like just in terms of Freud's terminology, he seems to be making this complex argument that we would need to tinker with a little bit.
I mean, I read death drive as there's an excess of life in the individual that would very well track with the death drive doing its work in the suicidal wager of reproduction. It has a productive capacity. It's the machining in the productive element of there's something driving the individual beyond its self-preservative drives to take the risk to make the suicidal wager of reproduction. And so I just want to also, before I move on to like the next thread and allow you to respond to this too, would be I also wanted to draw this kind of comparison that I think even is very Lacanian, and I don't recall if Lacan directly gets this, but other Lacanian theorists have said, I want to say maybe Todd McGowan, objet petit a is kind of related to the sense of buyer's remorse, right? Because we're castrated, and yeah, so that gap prevents us from full satisfaction. So I take that a step further, and I'm saying that the structural position of death is what leads to buyer's remorse, because we try to reach death in every exchange. We have this excess of life, we have this excess of libido that we're trying to exhaust via expenditure. By me spending $1,000 on a t-shirt, for example, like I'm trying to expend in a manner that is so intense that it ends the cycle. It takes me out of the cycle of reversibility. There's no more exchange. I'm not trapped in this never-ending cycle of desire, this kind of samsara of continually making purchases and wagers that don't satisfy ultimately. So I think that's an important component of what structurally petit mort a is doing, setting this structural limit that is akin to death in humans or biology. But if you have a rejoinder, please feel free before I kind of move on to the next thing that I want to touch point.
We can move on. It's something we can continue talking about.
What I found as well compelling about the ego and the id was the mapping, the psychoanalytic mapping of the unconscious, and how that inspires schizoanalytic cartographies. Like that link became very clear. I can't remember recently. I mean, you were talking about how Guattari had such a fidelity to Freud, and I mean, it just became so evident here.
He calls himself a Freudian, even at the end.
I mentioned earlier that
in Three Ecologies, he says he's always been a Freudian. So
the diagrammatics that inspire Guattari of this like mapping of the unconscious here that we've referred to as kind of the bagpipe. Again, I think I'm going to use that base image as the logo for this particular episode. So keep an eye out for how I transform that and expand that. But That's something I found fascinating because it's like I was looking at this not only in terms of a two-dimensional mapping, but a three-dimensional mapping, as I mentioned earlier, with relative relation to the id being a lower level of strata, the ego and the superego being this higher level of strata. There's like a gradient between those. There's not a hard border between the strata, right? They all flow into one another. So there's communication that occurs, or there's feedback, or there's some type of
The
processing.
epistrata and parastrata, as Deleuze and Guattari call it, right? Yeah.
Very well, very well. Excellent. That just is something that I wanted to highlight for the audience, and I think for our interests as well, that this kind of, again, it kind of goes to the debt of history and kind of, I mean, maybe the debt is I don't know, there's a positive connotation too with respect to like residues and debt from history, because it's like we have this legacy of Kant or Freud or what have you, that their ideas generate new grounds for possibility of thought. For the book example, we're drawing on Lyotard, Freud, Marx, Deleuze and Guattari, yada yada, right? All these thinkers. It goes to kind of like the micro politics sort of example, or micro fascisms, the little incremental shards that Deleuze and Guattari discuss, which they're fascinated by the micro level of how and the way that these little shards, which goes to the star example, right? It goes to individuation, the way that the multiplicity singularizes, but then also disperses. Like there's a twofold side to death as a finality, as a structuring limit, but also as a productive capacity or generator or operator, let's say. The third part of the triangle that I wanted to discuss relative to the text was, I found this super fascinating. This is fascinating to me, was how Freud mentions the shards, the like images. Do you recall this in the text where he talks about these little images, shards of perception in the unconscious, that made me start to think the images of the dream, the fractured nature of the dream imagery started to resemble that of film, because film itself is a series of discontinuity. It's a fragment of all these images that, I don't know, like it's sort of projected. There's a similar screen relationship between the dream and the film in this way, because the film is like these shards of images that all kind of become a type of a unity. Like this multiplicity becomes a singularity that is projected on this screen of the dreamer or the film goer. I'll just stop there and see what you have to say about that.
I was taking your example about the shards of images as akin to the mnemic residues or the memory traces
Yes, yes.
in the unconscious. It makes that interesting argument in various places, right? Even in the project, where he's like, look, perception and recording of memories can't happen at the same time. So he's wondering about if there are different registers, if they have to happen, if there are different, if there's one register and two different registrations. But in any case, yeah, this questions of memory traces is, I think, is really important for. This goes back to the unconscious not knowing death, not knowing time, not in the sense in which we understand it, in either sense of death and time. But he also seems to claim that the unconscious retains everything, all the traces. This conscious memory that we have gaps and holes in, we have all these amnesias, even like constitutively and structurally, which is why he'll talk about the latent phase, where all of these unconscious signifiers that were embedded like shards, to use now Laplanche's terms, and the unconscious under formation later on, après coup, right, and the Nachtraglichkeit, the after effect, take on significance and can be processed. This notion of the unconscious retaining everything, all of these traces, whereas consciousness and pre-consciousness are almost these little blips, and we have to force consciousness to remember, like in the etymological sense. put back together what we had just had conscious. I think that shows very distinct functions of the psychical apparatus.
I guess the third thing that I forgot to mention too, the hallucination, the dream, and the film all share in this kind of relationship to the shards of imagery and this kind of there's sort of a dreamlike hallucinatory aspect to film itself. I'm going to go ahead and read this. I think this is from the text. I should have noted what this is from, but I'm pretty sure it's from the ego and the id. So let me go ahead and read this. We think of the mnemic residues as being contained in systems which are directly adjacent to the system of preconscious consciousness, so that the cathexes of these residues can readily extend from within to the elements of the latter system. We immediately think here of hallucinations and of the fact that the most vivid memory is always distinguishable both from a hallucination and from an external perception. But it will also occur to us at once that when a memory is revived, the cathexis remains in the mnemic system, whereas a hallucination, which is not distinguishable from a perception, can arise when the cathexis does not merely spread over from the memory trace onto the perception, the preconscious element, but passes over to it entirely or something like that.
I believe that is from this text. I'm looking for it.
So it's like a hinge point, I think, here between the metapsychology for Freud and what Deleuze develops in his cinema works. The psychical life is like this play of images on the screen with this variable gradient between reality and these kind of fragmented stuff of perception and unconscious imagery and what have you.
This is where hallucination. Oh, it's page 13. Yeah, I found it. It's the job of the ego to do reality testing. The domain of the id is the domain of the pleasure principle, so that hallucinations on the domain of the id have as much reality as anything else. They are charged with affect, maybe even hypercharged, more so than, say, a perception from the external world that is tested to be real, quote unquote, actual. It's the ego's job to do reality testing. It's not the id's job to do that. The id is just as charged, perhaps even more directly, if you will. If the ego is the intercalating, the sort of the screen for the external world, then hallucinations have more of a reality for the id than perceptions from the external world, insofar as they are on the borderline. They may be perceived, but they arise from internal conflicts and drives, right? Does that make sense? So
that kind of goes over the hallucination, the cathexes pass over entirely to the perceptual element. So that image is lived as if it were external perception. I think that's paraphrasing.
Yeah, that's paraphrasing that same page. And I think his point being that it passes over because it is subjected to reality testing. And there's a way in which that testing might fail. I mean, we might take hallucinations to be real. We can go into a state of psychosis and take those, and sort of reality testing might not be as censorious and allow. We're even obviously aware of things like mirages in the sense of an oasis in the desert. It's that type of hallucination is coming from a very primordial drive of satisfying the need of thirst. It doesn't even have to be from a psychoid state. It can even be from a state of desperation or exhaustion. I mean, this is why he's talking about hypnagogic states, and obviously why Freud is thinking about dreams and the hallucinations, if you want to use that term, although it's perhaps not fair to, but the wish fulfillment's inherent in dreams, right? The way in which the dream work is composing itself around these unanalyzable nuclei, as he calls them. The navel of the dream is like a black hole around which the dream work is composing its frame.
I think the key point being that the same thing. So the mnemic images can take these different manifestations, maybe as the memory, as the dream image, as the hallucination, or the perception depending on how like our cathexes are directed relative to the screen, whether that be of
Mhm.
the literal screen of the cinema or of our unconscious.
Yeah, and if you remember, he gives a lot of, for the elements of the dream, the sort of the dream stuff, that the dream work is the content, if you want to use it. The dream is primarily focused around, not solely, but primarily it's the previous day's residue that he talks about, right? There are these residues from the previous day that he finds to be highly significant, and isolating those helps to put the jigsaw puzzle in place, at least as for its content, if not for what the dream work is doing. It shows what it's working with, some of its materials on the side of the images recalled.
That's what kind of fascinated me, was the way that are dreams in film or cinema share this, like, the fragmentary element of perception and memory. It's not governed by the reality testing, in the sense
Mhm.
that, what do we refer to relative to film? It's like our sense of disbelief.
Yeah, we suspend our sense of disbelief. It's a product of our immersion.
They operate the same way, and as far as like the cuts in the film or the
Mhm.
cuts in the memory or the mnemic imagery, but the way that they can have a sort of reality feel to them, even though like we're kind of unconsciously projecting them or something like that. Or I don't, what I mean? I don't know. Maybe you can help me integrate that thought. Thinking of film as the systematic hallucination. It's a technical component that is assembling the fragments. So there's like a machinic thing. The rest of this just delves my notes kind of delve more into Deleuze and the cinema stuff as it pertains here. So I don't know if we necessarily need to get into all of that. If you have anything that you want to discuss before we wrap up, I'm happy to go into this a little bit further. But I think we've kind of gotten to those sort of points that I wanted to, relative to cinema and the unconscious and the shards and perception and the screen aspects.
On page 58, and this allows us maybe to say a little bit, we don't have to go too deep into it, on the superego, which would force us to go back through all of the discussion of the Oedipus complex and the positive and negative ways of resolving it, the way in which for Freud the superego is about this outcome of the identification or not with the father or the mother. It's all highly interesting, and it's stuff that we've talked about a lot, and something that we can get back to. And I beg the listeners' forgiveness. But on page 58, Freud discusses the three kinds of anxiety, which he says is related to three dangers: the dangers from the external world, from the libido of the id, and from the severity of the superego. And he says, he refers to anxiety as the expression of a retreat from danger. Now, here he's defining it differently than I had said in relation to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, because it was there that it was actually confronting danger in dreams, which, to be fair, is not literal danger, but a recreation, a reviviscence or reminiscence of dangers lived. It was there that anxiety was preparing us for, was retroactively giving us the preparation of the psychical resistance to withstand the trauma that pierced the boundaries of the ego, something like this. Because it's precisely trauma that he sees as a breach in the force field, if you will, the shield, the protective shell of the ego. And it's the anxiety dreams that are preparing us with anxiety so that we can be ready for the shock, so that we can retroactively will have been ready in this future anterior for this shock that we had lived through. And again, this goes to the fact that the unconscious is ignorant of linear time. It's putting us back into this old situation as though we could have been, will have been able to have been ready for the shock, the trauma. And for him, it's about mastery. It's a wish to have had mastery. But here he's defining it as anxiety expresses, maybe this isn't in contradiction, but it expresses a retreat from danger. And as I said, that seems to contradict what he was saying in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where it's actually anxiety was actually preparing us to have confronted the danger. But in any case, we could say it is related to fight or flight reflex. As he says on page 59, the ego is the actual state of anxiety threatened by danger. From three directions, it develops the flight reflex by withdrawing its own cathexis from the menacing perception. I just wanted to say that to me would be like that and the Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Again, those two texts would be the two places I would want to work through to show that for Simon Dunn, the way he works through anxiety, it's not about retreating from danger. And it's not necessarily about mastery in any straightforward sense, although perhaps in his analysis of anxiety, we could see that Freudian mastery lurks in the background. It's about the way in which anxiety prepares us for a certain individuation that we have to go through by abandoning our individuated structures. There's a sense in which we could call it, in the classical sense, it prepares us for undergoing a dissolution or death of the ego in order to individuate otherwise. He even goes further by saying anxiety exacerbated is the failure to go through the trans-individual collective to solve these collective problems as though we could solve them alone in our solitude. I think that gives a different tinge and reading to the dynamic that Freud is isolating in Beyond the Pleasure Principle when he's looking at these these soldiers suffering from war trauma. There's a sense in which the trans individual means of solving problems by means of war is a type of individuation forced through trauma that cannot be done solely on the basis of any one soldier, any one soul, any one psychical apparatus and mind, right? It's a problem that can only be solved it's a conflict that can only be solved through the means of the collective, but it's lived and experienced intensely by the individual. And what means do they have to respond to that trauma? For Simon Dunn, the anxiety dream isn't just that the individual goes back to having all the anxiety they need to face the individual trauma of the shelling and warfare, but as though, I'm not even trying to get Jungian about it, but as though there were a means retroactively for the society to have been able to solve the problem trans individually with the individual as a part of it, to forego that calamity itself. It's a kind of intense time travel that Freud is hypothesizing, and that maybe Simondon allows us to read anxiety differently than Freud. And it's again why Deleuze and Guattari don't really have much time for discussing anxiety. They're much more interested in discussing libidinal investments. And I guess I would just say, in terms of the superego, which he relates to the categorical imperative, although doesn't really do much in terms of the Kantian way of looking at it. I think Kant is, again, trying to do something transcendental, where Freud is trying to do something transhistorical. Kant is trying to think about the way in which we can make these universal moral laws whereby everyone complying with them, whether idealistically or not, contributes to the overall moral good and can hold sway for all situations and activities. But Freud is thinking of the categorical imperative as something imposed historically, transhistorically, something we inherit. And I think that's why he is so interested in, like, where does this Oedipus complex guilt, where does this inheritance of the consciousness of guilt come from? We inherited it from murdering the primordial father. We inherited it from bygone generations. The debt has built up and become infinite. The debt and guilt is felt to be something beyond and beneath and surrounding us. And he even quotes page 54 and 55, what is now holding sway in the superego is as it were a pure culture of the death instinct. And in fact, it often enough succeeds in driving the ego into death if the ego does not fend off its tyrant, the superego, in time by the change round into mania. And this goes back to my point about Eros and Thanatos diffusing. This is on page 56 and 57. After sublimation, the erotic component no longer has the power to bind the whole of the destructiveness that was combined with it, and this is released in the form of an inclination to aggression and destruction. This diffusion would be the source of the general character of harshness and cruelty exhibited by the ideal, which is superego. It's dictatorial thou shalt. And it's interesting that he calls it a thou shalt when, if you look at the Ten Commandments, it's not a thou shalt as though it's an affirmative, it's a negative, it's a thou shalt not. But that was sort of some of my reflections on the superego. And it's interesting, I think, that Freud wants to say that to a certain extent, superego and the ego, that the superego is much more unconscious than the ego. Oh, and the last thing, there was a great quote. I had marked this off. The last thing, and then we can wrap up. This is a really, I say a really, this is a pretty good quote. He says, this is page 53. One may go further and venture the hypothesis that a great part of the sense of guilt must normally remain unconscious because the origin of conscience is intimately connected with the Oedipus complex, which belongs to the unconscious. And the part of this that I like is the following. If anyone were inclined to put forward the paradoxical proposition that the normal man is not only far more immoral than he believes, but also far more moral than he knows, psychoanalysis, on whose finding the first half of the assertion rests, would have no objection to raise against the second half. And the footnote says this proposition is only apparently a paradox. It simply states that human nature has a far greater extent, both for good and for evil, than it thinks it has, i.e., than its ego is aware of through conscious perception. That's a pretty good way of summing up Freud's, or an element of Freud's ethics of psychoanalysis, to use a Lacanian phrase, right? Far more moral than he believes, but far more moral than he knows. It's kind of an interesting distinction between belief and knowledge that Freud is making there. But it's food for thought. It's food for considering. Freud makes that point, right, in this work itself. He's like, look, when we tell a patient, hey, your cure is going well, you're progressing, and they take it badly and they retrench back into their symptoms and exacerbate them. Freud's like, what do we do with this shit? How do we tackle this? And that's why he consistently sticks with a term or phrase that he hates, but that he thinks is correct: unconscious sense of guilt. He's always asking, isn't guilt something we're conscious of? Isn't it something? And of course, I've told you, Coop, that Schuld is guilt, is debt, is blame, is fault. It's a very broad word in German, right? And so for Freud, it's like, how are we not aware of guilt? Wouldn't it only be something conscious? And I think this is more evidence to why he is calling what in this text either ego ideal or superego. Why he is formulating this idea of the superego as this representative of the id, right? As if the id were able to rear up behind our back from the depths and swell up as the, not just looming over us as the figure of the fathers, but also he hypothesizes as it's the genesis, it's the origin, it's the original motivation for, vengeful gods. And it even takes on the aspects of the divine, providence, destiny, but too can be seen in the superiors, like of the boss or the general. So there are daddies everywhere for those with eyes to see, right? I mean, that's kind of what Freud is telling us.
I'm glad you brought that up because this reminds me, one of the big things that I wanted to draw or bring to surface in this discussion was the connection between dead labor and the inheritance of the id as this, what I'm calling thanatic residue. So we inherit this sense of guilt that we didn't actually, so punishment precedes structurally guilt. Before we even have the chance to commit the crime, we've already been punished. We've already been saddled with an amortized relationship to the historical id or historical labor that has been crystallized and mobilized against us as machinery, as automation, as fixed capital, as symptoms that we inherited, guilt and the economic problem of masochism being a key touchstone as well. And the escalating, there's a gradient there where the superego becomes ever increasingly like it demands more and more of us over time. It begins to resemble the demands of capital in terms of exploitation. So, like, this manifests in capitalism as the gig economy, or where the individual laborer is asked to sacrifice ever more and more as the scapegoat for accumulation by capital. I have to sleep in my car. I have to forego. I can't take vacations. I can't rest. I can't take a day off. I've got to risk and risk and risk ever more and ever more because of this way that dead labor, the structural position of the laborer is like overwhelmed by capital because the debt constantly, or the debt has been building up. Labor can't outproduce the historical thing, right? So the psychical element of the id is, and the superego are making demands of the individual that exceed its ability to resolve. And that may be going towards your point with Simondon as far as anxiety and like the individual's inability to discharge that or something like that. That's a little sloppy, but you'll forgive me for that. The individual becomes the scapegoat for the historical residue of the id or of dead labor, these pre-existing debt relations and things like that, that we're kind of stuck with a problematic. And then we have to, like, the individual moral failings become the kind of scapegoat for the conditions of failure versus like the structural relationship. So, and then again, I guess too, another component of that with respect to the harsh superego is that like the punishment, the self-punishment, the masochistic element that the individual feels like is going to discharge that debt only compounds it and intensifies it. So that's kind of a big problem that leads to like stochastic violence and eruptions of shit. A lot of that's what we'll discuss in the book, so I don't want to like spend another hour going through all of that, but
we'll have plenty of time to elaborate that in the future.
Yeah, if you didn't have anything else, I think we can wrap up there.
Yeah, that sounds good.
That will bring to a conclusion another brilliant episode of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next time.
Of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.